When you look at the concept of hoarding, the visual that usually comes to mind is, very physical.
Oh, absolutely.
You picture the suburban house with towering stacks of newspapers from like 1998, boxes of clothes untouched for decades, broken appliances just blocking the hallway.
Right. It's that very physical manifestation of the phrase, I might need this someday.
Exactly. And we understand that impulse because it's rooted in a really basic human instinct. The fear of needing something and not having it often outweighs the immediate, tangible inconvenience of the clutter.
Yeah, I mean, you hold on to the broken toaster because throwing it away feels like a permanent decision, right? One you might regret later.
Right. And this just-in-case mindset has driven human behavior for a very long time. But in the physical world, the limits of that mindset are dictated by square footage.
Sure. Eventually, you just run out of rooms to put things in. The physical environment literally forces a behavioral change.
But when we move into the digital realm, that constraint completely vanishes. We're looking at a completely different kind of hoarding today. It's invisible, it doesn't take up physical floor space in your office, and for decades, businesses around the world were actively encouraged to do it.
By their own legal counsel and IT departments, no less.
Right. Because data storage became exponentially cheaper year over year, the prevailing wisdom was, well, keep every single email. Keep every transaction receipt, every customer log, every IP address indefinitely. The corporate strategy was basically keep it all, just in case.
That was genuinely the accepted best practice. Because if a dispute arose 5 years down the line or an audit happened, having a complete digital history was considered the ultimate safety net.
But that digital safety net has completely inverted. If you're navigating your company's data architecture today, or even just trying to understand the invisible rules that govern what happens to your personal info, once you click accept on a terms of service agreement, you're standing in the middle of a massive collision.
A very expensive collision between law and technology.
Exactly. And so, welcome to this deep dive. Today's mission is to navigate this incredibly complex, often contradictory world of data retention.
We've got a lot to get through today.
We really do. We are exploring a stack of sources ranging from legal breakdowns of Australian, Californian, and European privacy laws, all the way to cutting-edge research on AI data center infrastructure, and honestly, the death of the right to be forgotten.
Which is a huge shift.
Massive. The core paradox we're examining is that just as human laws around the world are aggressively demanding that businesses delete personal data, artificial intelligence is making it technically impossible in some cases to actually forget anything.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the sheer scale of this collision, you really have to look at how complicated basic record keeping has become on a localized level, even before you introduce global AI.
Right, and the Australian regulatory environment provides a perfect case study for this. Our source material from Zerker Data actually terms this the compliance trap.
So let's examine that Australian landscape. If you operate a business in Australia, you're subject to traditional minimum retention periods.
Basic record-keeping laws.
Right. The legal system requires you to keep specific records to prove you are operating legally. And according to the breakdowns from Spritlaw and Zerko Data, the common baselines most business owners operate under are 5 and 7 years. But the application of those timelines is incredibly nuanced.
Yeah, those 5 and 7 year rules are often treated as universal truths by businesses, but they are highly, highly specific.
How so?
Well, for tax and accounting purposes, the Australian Taxation Office requires businesses to retain records for a minimum of 5 years. But, and this is the kicker, that 5-year clock doesn't start on the day the document is created.
Wait, it doesn't?
No, it starts from the date you log your tax return or from when the relevant transaction is completed, whichever happens to be later.
Oh, wow. Okay, so if a business buys a piece of capital equipment, like a tractor or something, in January, but doesn't actually lodge the tax return claiming that depreciation until October,
then the 5-year retention clock for that specific invoice doesn't begin until October.
that is going to trip a lot of people up.
Absolutely, and that's just the ATO standard. Then you have to layer on the 7-year requirements.
Right, the Fair Work Act.
Exactly. Fair Work requires employers to keep comprehensive employment records. We're talking pay slips, hours worked, superannuation contribution details, all of that for a minimum of 7 years.
And ASIC has their own rules too, right?
Yeah, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, they mandate that company financial records, board meeting minutes, corporate constitutions, all of that must also be retained for 7 years.
So as a business owner, I might look at those overlapping timelines, 5 years for tax, 7 years for employment and financials, and just decide to implement a blanket policy. Isn't it safer to just buy more cloud storage and keep everything forever? Storage is cheap.
Mhm.
I could just configure my AWS to auto-delete after 7 years and 1 day and assume I'm safe.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that assumption is precisely how organizations fall into severe non-compliance today.
Really?
Yeah, because the legal framework is not consolidated into two clean categories. The source material highlights that there are over 80 different acts at both the state and federal levels in Australia regulating record retention.
80 different apps.
Over 80! A healthcare provider managing patient records is subject to entirely different retention schedules than a financial services firm managing mortgages. And state-level legislation often introduces additional, highly specific mandates on top of the federal laws. The whole 5 to 7 years concept is a dangerous oversimplification.
Okay, given that complexity, with 80 overlapping acts and differing timelines for different data, the historical reaction of an IT department makes perfect sense. If figuring out the exact deletion date for every file is an administrative nightmare and cloud storage costs fractions of a cent, the path of least resistance is to keep everything permanently.
It used to be, yeah. It removed the risk of prematurely deleting a document you might need for some obscure state-level audit.
But that strategy doesn't work anymore.
Not at all. The 2025 reforms to the Privacy Act 1988 fundamentally changed the calculus here. This is the exact mechanism of the compliance trap we mentioned.
Right, because the ATO, ASIC, and Fair Work dictate what you must keep. That's the floor.
Exactly. But the updated Privacy Act establishes a very aggressive ceiling, specifically under the Australian Privacy Principle 11, or APP 11.2.
And APP 11.2 dictates what you must not keep.
Precisely. It states that once personal information is no longer needed for any purpose for which it may be used or disclosed under the APPs, the entity must take reasonable steps to destroy the information or ensure it is de-identified.
So the moment that 7-year obligation to Fair Work finishes for an ex-employee's file.
If the business doesn't have another legally recognized reason to retain it, holding onto that data becomes an active violation of the Privacy Act.
That is wild. The moment the legal minimum is satisfied, the data instantly transforms from a required compliance asset into a legal liability.
It's a complete trap. The law is pulling the business in two completely opposing directions simultaneously. Keep it, or face regulatory penalties from the ATO. But don't delete it fast enough once the ATO is satisfied, and you face regulatory penalties from the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner.
The OAIC. And the stakes are incredibly high now, right?
Very high. The enforcement landscape has shifted dramatically to back up that ceiling. The OAIC is not simply issuing warnings anymore.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
The penalty structure for serious or repeated privacy breaches can reach up to $50 million.
Wow.
Or 3 times the benefit obtained through the misuse of the information, or 30% of the company's adjusted domestic turnover during the breach period. And the courts will apply whichever of those 3 figures is the greatest.
30% of adjusted domestic turnover is catastrophic. That goes way beyond a cost of doing business. That's corporate insolvency territory.
Absolutely. The Zerko data source points to a landmark enforcement action from October 2025 to illustrate this. It involved Australian clinical labs.
Right. They were hit with a $5.8 million civil penalty.
Yeah, following a data breach that exposed the information of over 223,000 individuals. But the critical takeaway from that enforcement action wasn't just about their perimeter security failing. I mean, firewalls fail. Breaches happen.
Right. So what was the focus?
The regulatory scrutiny focused heavily on the sheer volume of historical data that was just sitting in their systems when the breach occurred.
Because the data that hackers cannot access is the data that the organization has already systematically destroyed.
Exactly. If a company aggressively purges records the moment they cross that 7-year threshold, the blast radius of a subsequent cyber attack is mathematically reduced.
But destroying that data isn't always a simple unilateral decision, right? The laws demanding deletion have built-in exceptions.
They do, and it complicates the process further. For instance, if an organization is managing personal info contained within a Commonwealth record, the deletion mandates of APP 11.2 are superseded by the Archives Act 1983.
Meaning they can't just delete it.
Right. Government agencies can't simply purge files because they feel they aren't needed anymore. They are bound by highly structured National Archives disposal authorities.
And for private sector businesses, there's the complication of the litigation hold.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge one.
Because if an organization receives a subpoena, or even if leadership just reasonably anticipates a future dispute or an audit, the normal data destruction schedule has to immediately stop.
The expectation of litigation freezes everything. Imagine a specific internal memo reaches its 7-year retention limit on a Tuesday. It's scheduled for routine automated deletion on Wednesday.
Okay.
But the legal department receives notice of a pending lawsuit on Tuesday afternoon where that memo could be relevant. That automated deletion must be manually overridden.
Wow.
Because allowing that document to be destroyed, even if it was part of a standard compliant retention schedule, can be construed as spoliation of evidence. That introduces criminal liability.
Navigating that space between the minimum retention period, the maximum retention ceiling, and the sudden freeze of a litigation hold requires immense precision. But let's look at the actual mechanics of destruction.
Okay.
Say a business has perfectly timed it. The legal retention period is over, no lawsuits. The data must be destroyed under APP 11.2. Deleting a digital file usually means just dragging it to a computer's trash bin. And physical destruction usually means putting a file in a blue recycling bin.
And neither of those actions meets the legal standard for destruction.
Not at all.
No. The OAIC guidelines are highly specific regarding what constitutes reasonable steps to destroy personal information. Throwing physical records into a standard recycling bin is a severe breach of protocol.
So what's required?
Physical destruction requires cross-cut shredding, pulping, or pulverizing the material so it physically cannot be reconstructed. And if you outsource this to a third-party vendor, you have to maintain a certified chain of custody.
Which culminates in a formal certificate of destruction. So you have to generate a new piece of compliance paperwork to prove you legally destroyed the old compliance paperwork.
You need an auditable paper trail, yes. And in the digital realm, emptying a recycle bin merely removes the directory pointers. It just tells the operating system the space is available.
But the actual ones and zeros remain on the drive.
Yeah, and they can be easily recovered with basic forensic software. Secure digital destruction requires the data blocks to be actively overwritten with random data patterns multiple times. That renders the original info unrecoverable.
But in modern enterprise architecture, data isn't always sitting neatly in an isolated folder. It's woven into complex relational databases, replicated across multiple cloud zones for disaster recovery.
Right.
Completely overwriting a specific individual's data without corrupting the surrounding database architecture can be technically unfeasible.
And the OAIC acknowledges that technical limitation. If irretrievable destruction is genuinely not possible within a complex database, the framework permits organizations to put the data, quote-unquote, beyond use.
But that's not a casual designation, right?
No, not at all. It requires implementing severe cryptographic access controls, isolating the data from primary business systems, and a formal commitment that the data will never be accessed again until tech evolves to allow for its complete destruction.
What about going from physical to digital to just mitigate the physical footprint? Can a business just scan all its legacy paper documents into a high-res PDF and then shred the paper originals?
In many jurisdictions, yes, with caveats. In New South Wales, for example, the General Retention and Disposal Authority, known as GA45, permits this digitization strategy.
Okay, so you can do it.
Provided your quality assurance processes guarantee the digital copy is a flawless representation of the original. But the Zerko data source points out some fascinating historical exceptions.
Like what?
State archives created prior to 1980, or physical documents that hold specific intrinsic legal primacy, like original wet ink signed deeds, they cannot be destroyed under any circumstances.
Regardless of how good the digital scan is.
Exactly. The physical paper itself is the recognized legal entity.
Okay, so we have established that maintaining compliance strictly within the borders of Australia requires a dedicated legal team, automated scheduling, certified physical destruction, and understanding 80 overlapping acts. But the internet is inherently borderless.
True.
If I'm an Aussie software company, I'm not just selling to Sydney. I'm interacting with users in California, Germany, the UK. Navigating the local Australian compliance trap is only the baseline. When you step onto the global stage, the regulatory requirements fracture completely.
The fragmentation of global privacy law is really the secondary layer of this compliance trap. California provides a stark contrast to the Australian model, specifically under the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA.
Which has a pervasive myth around it, right?
Yeah.
There's an assumption in corporate circles that California also operates on a standard 7-year retention rule, similar to the Aussie shorthand.
Yeah, and our source material from CLIM specifically deconstructs that myth. The CCPA does not contain a universal 7-year retention mandate.
It doesn't.
No. In fact, California's framework generally avoids fixed statutory timelines entirely. You won't find a rule saying Retain this data class for 3 years. The entire architecture of the CCPA is built on transparency and strict purpose limitation.
So rather than telling a business how long to keep the data, the CCPA forces the business to declare its own timeline and then holds them legally accountable to that self-imposed deadline.
Exactly. The law requires entities to explicitly disclose their specific retention periods for every single category of personal data they collect.
And if they can't give a fixed time period,
Then they have to disclose the exact criteria they use to determine that period. The enforcement mechanism in California hinges on the concept of what is reasonably necessary.
reasonably necessary.
Right. A business is only legally permitted to retain personal data for the duration that is reasonably necessary to fulfill the specific purpose they disclose to the consumer at the point of collection.
Okay, so if an e-commerce platform collects the customer's email and physical address to deliver a product, they've disclosed a purpose. Order fulfillment.
And once that product is delivered and the standard return window expires, the purpose of order fulfillment is complete. Under the CCPA, the business cannot unilaterally decide to hold on to that email and physical location indefinitely just to send marketing materials 3 years later.
Unless they explicitly disclosed that secondary marketing purpose when they collected it.
And got the necessary permissions. Retaining consumer data indefinitely without an ongoing, justified, and disclosed business purpose is a primary trigger for regulatory action in California.
So the CCPA creates a framework where the business has to constantly justify its possession of the data. Now, when we look across the Atlantic to Europe, the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, introduces an even more rigid structure, and a business operating entirely out of Melbourne might assume European laws are irrelevant to them.
Which is a huge mistake. That ignores the concept of extraterritorial reach. The GDPR was explicitly designed to project jurisdiction beyond the borders of the European Union.
So how does it trigger for an Aussie business?
If an Australian entity offers goods or services to individuals located in the EU, or if they monitor the behavior of EU individuals, like deploying tracking cookies on a website accessed by a user in France, that Australian entity is fully subject to the GDPR.
Even if the service is free, or if they have no physical servers in Europe?
Doesn't matter. They are subject to the law. And what's fascinating here is the structural difference between the Australian Privacy Act and the GDPR.
Right, because under the Australian framework, a business doesn't necessarily have to document a specific, formal, lawful basis for every single data processing activity, even though they have to follow the APPs.
But the GDPR demands exactly that. An explicit, formally documented, lawful basis for every interaction with the European citizen's data.
You literally have to prove why you have it.
Yes, you must be able to prove you have explicit consent, or that the processing is a strict contractual necessity. You can't process data simply because it's convenient for your business.
And the divergence gets really intense during a crisis. If an organization suffers a data breach, the incident response timelines dictated by these jurisdictions are wildly misaligned.
Oh, completely misaligned. Under Australia's notifiable data breaches scheme, an organization generally has up to 30 days to assess a suspected breach and formally notify the OAIC and the affected individuals.
30 days is a decent amount of time to figure out what happened.
But the GDPR operates on a drastically compressed timeline. If an organization experiences a data breach that poses a high risk to individuals, they are legally required to notify the relevant European supervisory authority within 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach.
72 hours. That means if a security team detects an anomaly on a Friday evening, the organization has to complete forensic triage, assess the scope of the compromise, determine the risk level, and draft formal regulatory notifications before Monday evening.
Yeah. And failing to meet that deadline puts the company in immediate violation of European law, which is entirely separate from the actual liability of the breach itself.
So if I'm an Aussie business with European customers, do I have to run two entirely different data retention rulebooks? Because running parallel compliance playbooks based on where a user lives sounds like an administrative impossibility. A system admin can't pause during a hack to see if a compromised user ID is in Sydney or Munich before starting the clock.
Exactly, you can't. Which is why the Shieldbox source outlines the necessity of the highest standard strategy for dual compliance.
The highest standard strategy.
Right. The only viable path is to discard the lower tier requirements and rebuild your entire corporate compliance architecture to satisfy the strictest mandates of all the overlapping jurisdictions. You run one unified playbook that defaults to the most aggressive standard.
Got it. So if the GDPR demands a 72-hour notification window, you adopt a 72-hour notification policy globally. By adhering to the European standard, you inherently satisfy the 30-day Australian requirement.
Exactly. But standardizing policies is only the procedural layer. The physical location of the servers hosting this data creates an entirely separate legal hazard.
Because of data transfers.
Yeah. The GDPR imposes severe restrictions on cross-border data transfers. You cannot freely move the personal data of EU citizens to servers located outside the European Economic Area unless that country has received an adequacy decision from the European Commission.
Meaning their local privacy laws offer equivalent protection to the GDPR.
Right. And historically, the U.S. has faced continuous legal challenges with this due to intelligence surveillance powers. And Australia also does not hold a blanket adequacy decision from the EU.
So moving EU data to an Australian server is a problem.
It requires the implementation of standard contractual clauses, which are complex legal mechanisms to bind the organization to GDPR standards.
So how does the shield box strategy solve this?
Through rigorous localization, they recommend utilizing Australian-hosted servers that are engineered to align with the highest tiers of local government cybersecurity standards. Specifically, the Australian Signals Directorate's Essential 8 framework, IS 27701 certification, and strict adherence to APP8 regarding cross-border disclosures.
Okay, so by anchoring the data onshore in Australia, the business satisfies its local obligations and avoids moving Aussie data offshore. And by using military-grade ISO 27001 security and standard contractual clauses, they satisfy the European regulator simultaneously.
It's an elegant architectural solution. You build to the highest possible standard, and it covers your liabilities everywhere.
But, and this is a massive but, this entire global legal architecture, the 7-year timelines, the transparency mandates, the 72-hour windows, it is all built on a foundational assumption about technology that is rapidly becoming obsolete.
It really is, because these laws were drafted for the era of the relational database.
Right. The laws assume that data is stored in discrete, organized structures, rows and columns. If a user in Germany invokes their GDPR rights and demands deletion, the law assumes an admin can just execute a query, locate the row, and definitively hit delete. The record is purged, compliance achieved.
The legal framework assumes data is modular and extractable. But the source material from tech policy, press, highlights a paradigm-shifting flaw in this logic today.
What happens when the data isn't in a database? What happens when that personal information has been fed into a generative artificial intelligence model?
This introduces a fundamental change in the physics of data storage, the tech policy. Press source argues that Article 17 of the GDPR, the famous right to be forgotten, is effectively obsolete in the era of large language models.
And to understand why, we have to look at how these systems actually process information. The analogy I like to use is that feeding personal data into an AI is like baking a cake. You combine flour, sugar, and a specific egg into a bowl, mix it, bake it, it transforms chemically into a cake.
Right.
If a consumer comes up to the baker afterward and demands the return or destruction of their specific egg, you literally can't do it. You can't ask the baker to take your specific egg out once the cake is baked. It's been fundamentally transformed.
And the mechanics of neural networks operate on that exact principle of transformation. AI models do not operate like filing cabinets. They don't store information in discrete retrievable entries.
Consider a model like OpenAI's GPT-4.
Right. It operates on an estimated 1.8 trillion parameters, trained on petabytes of text scraped from the internet. When an email address or a forum post is fed into that training set, the algorithm does not save a copy of that text.
It breaks the text down into tokens and analyzes the mathematical relationships between them.
Exactly. It analyzes the statistical likelihood of specific words or tokens appearing in proximity to one another. The original data is dismantled and converted into abstract mathematical weights scattered across a massive neural web. The model learns the pattern derived from the data, but it does not contain the data itself.
So if a European regulator issues a legally binding order to an AI company demanding the erasure of a specific citizen's data, the engineering team cannot comply using traditional methods. There is no search and delete function for a trillion-parameter neural network. The data is baked into the weights of the model.
The only technically guaranteed method to completely remove the influence of that single individual's data is to discard the entire model and initiate a completely new training run from scratch using a newly scrubbed data set.
And retraining a foundational model like GPT-4 is a massive undertaking. We're talking tens of thousands of specialized processors running at maximum capacity for months, consuming massive amounts of electricity at a cost of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars.
It is economically and computationally impossible to retrain a model every time a single user out of millions submits a standard privacy deletion request.
This creates an intractable standoff between the law and computational physics. But the GDPR isn't entirely rigid here, right?
No, it's not. The source material indicates that the law contains built-in exceptions that AI companies are aggressively leveraging as legal loopholes to avoid compliance.
Which exception?
Article 17 of the GDPR allows a data controller to refuse a deletion request if the processing is deemed necessary for archiving purposes in the public interest, for scientific or historical research, or for exercising the right of freedom of expression.
Ah. So the legal teams for these AI developers are arguing that creating large language models constitutes scientific research or serves a broad public interest.
Exactly, giving them the legal cover to deny individual deletion requests without technically violating the regulation.
It is a profound loophole. But jurisdictions are trying to close it. In September 2024, California Advanced Assembly Bill 1008. This is the first major state legislation trying to allow consumers to exercise deletion rights over AI specifically.
AB 1008 is an aggressive attempt to regulate the space, but it exposes ongoing legal and technical ambiguity because the legislation focuses heavily on controlling the outputs of the artificial intelligence.
It tries to establish a framework where consumers can demand that an AI system must not generate their personal information in its responses.
But filtering the output of an AI model doesn't solve the fundamental issue of the underlying training data. Mandating that a system can't speak about a person is very different from mandating that the system must forget the person exists.
Placing a filter on the tap does not remove the contaminant from the reservoir.
Exactly. The legal scholars analyzing AB 1008 note that it remains incredibly murky whether consumers possess the legal authority to force AI developers to retroactively purge their info from the foundational training sets.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This theoretical tension between retention laws and neural networks becomes highly visible when we look at real-world consumer AI products. We can look at OpenAI's new AI agent, Operator, as a primary case study.
And the distinction between traditional AI chatbots and AI agents is critical here.
Right, because when I interact with ChatGPT, I enter a prompt, get text back, and the interaction ends. And if I delete that conversation, the Mashable source says OpenAI retains that deleted data for 30 days before permanently wiping it.
30 days provides a standard buffer for system backups and security reviews. But Operator has a vastly different policy. Because Operator is an active AI agent, it executes complex tasks on the user's behalf.
Given a goal, it can autonomously navigate the internet, click buttons, log into websites.
And to do that, the AI model has to visually comprehend the graphical interface of the computer. It needs to see what the user sees.
Which means taking continuous, real-time screenshots of the user's desktop as it works.
Yes. And the data retention policy for Operator is that any deleted data, including text prompts, operational history, and those desktop screenshots, is retained by OpenAI for 90 days.
3 times as long as ChatGPT?
Yeah.
Wait, so it's taking screenshots of my desktop, and OpenAI can just look at them for 3 months after I explicitly hit delete. Those screenshots could capture highly sensitive stuff. Open banking portals, private emails, confidential business docs. Why does an AI agent need a 90-day retention period for deleted data?
An official spokesperson for OpenAI clarified to Mashable that the extended retention period is required specifically because AI agents represent a novel emerging technology. The 90-day window gives their security teams time to understand and review potential abuse vectors.
Abuse vectors, because an autonomous agent introduces entirely new categories of misuse.
Exactly. A malicious actor could instruct the agent to execute coordinated scraping attacks, automate fraudulent accounts, or launch sophisticated spam campaigns. Because the tech interacts with external systems, the potential for disruption is way higher than a chatbot.
So they argue they need a longer runway to investigate misuse and preserve evidence. But for 3 months, an archive of the user's private desktop activity is sitting on a server, accessible to OpenAI engineers and authorized service providers.
To mitigate the obvious surveillance risks, OpenAI has engineered specific guardrails.
Okay, what kind of guardrails?
Well, the agent operates with a built-in takeover mode. When the vision model detects it has navigated to a recognized sensitive input field, like a password prompt on a bank site, it automatically pauses, stops taking screenshots, and returns manual control to the human user.
Okay, that's something.
And for highly sensitive environments like email clients, it requires a persistent watch mode, meaning it cannot operate entirely in the background without active human oversight.
Those guardrails reduce the immediate risk of capturing a password in plain text. But the broader retention policy remains. By default, the interactions and captured screenshots are not just stored for abuse review, they are eligible to be ingested as training data for future models.
Unless the user actively intervenes. The system is an opt-out architecture. The only way to stop it from training future models is to manually toggle off model sharing in the data controls.
And since most consumers never change default privacy settings, petabytes of highly personalized desktop activity are flowing into these training reservoirs. We've explored the software architecture that makes forgetting this impossible, but this software doesn't exist in a vacuum. Where is all this data actually living?
This brings us to the physical reality of AI data centers.
Right, and the academic paper by Chirag Devendrakumar Parikh in 2025 details a radical transformation happening in the physical architecture of these facilities. Traditional data centers were engineered around central processing units, or CPUs.
They rely on massive industrial air conditioning, using raised floors to push cold air up through the server racks.
And a standard CPU server rack consumes between 5 to 15 kilowatts of power.
Which is manageable with forced air cooling. But AI workloads, specifically training large language models, require massive parallel computation, specialized hardware like graphics processing units, GPUs, or TPUs, and ASICs.
And when you fill a single server rack with hundreds of dense AI processors, the power density curve just goes vertical.
We are no longer in the 5 to 15 kilowatt range. High-density AI server racks draw anywhere from 30 to 50 kilowatts of power per rack.
50 kilowatts in the space of a refrigerator. That introduces extreme thermodynamic challenges. The Parikh paper explores the physics here, specifically the I²R calculation.
Yeah, the physics dictate that power loss, which manifests as heat, is equal to the square of the current multiplied by the electrical resistance. If a single modern GPU draws 300 watts at 12 volts, it's pulling 25 amps of current.
And since heat generation scales exponentially with the square of the current, even microscopic wiring resistance generates immense thermal output.
Exactly. When you aggregate thousands of these GPUs, traditional forced air cooling systems suffer complete thermodynamic failure. Air just lacks the thermal density to extract that much heat.
So to prevent these multi-million-dollar clusters from physically melting down, they've had to abandon air cooling entirely.
They're transitioning rapidly to liquid immersion cooling.
You literally dunk the servers in fluid.
Yes. The server blades are physically submerged in engineered non-conductive dielectric fluids, or they use direct-to-chip liquid cooling manifolds that pump coolant directly across the processors.
This raises an important question. How do you even regulate something growing this fast? We started by discussing privacy lawyers debating 5-year versus 7-year document retention. But the physical realities of AI data centers create compliance nightmares that have nothing to do with data privacy and everything to do with industrial safety and environmental regulation.
The Parikh research highlights that the sheer power density creates immediate thermal hazards and the risk of massive environmental contamination if those dielectric fluids were to breach containment. But the most complex regulatory challenge is actually electromagnetic compatibility, or EMC.
Right. Electromagnetic compatibility refers to the reality that electronic components emit electromagnetic radiation when they operate.
When thousands of GPUs are executing trillions of calculations per second, communicating across high-throughput interconnects, they are rapidly flipping billions of microscopic transistors. This high-frequency switching generates substantial electromagnetic fields.
And if an AI data center isn't meticulously engineered with specialized shielding, that electromagnetic interference can leak outside the physical facility.
And that leakage is not just theoretical. High-frequency EMI can severely degrade signal integrity in surrounding telecom infrastructure, disrupt radio frequencies, and potentially interfere with critical medical equipment in nearby hospitals.
Because the risk is so severe, international bodies maintain strict legal limits on commercial IT radiation. Standards like CCPA 32 in Europe or FCC Part 15 in the US establish those legal boundaries.
But just like privacy laws, the global hardware regulations are heavily fragmented. Hyperscale cloud providers, companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, face a vast global fragmentation map.
The legal limit in a European jurisdiction under CCPA 32 might differ slightly from limits in Japan, which differ from the FCC in the US.
Exactly. So if a hyperscaler designs a new 50-kilowatt AI rack, they can't just mass produce it and install it globally. It must undergo rigorous physical testing and certification in every single jurisdiction.
And a delay in certification means losing milliseconds of compute availability, which equals millions of dollars in lost revenue. You can't build a massive data center in Germany, power it up, and then discover your electromagnetic emissions violate local laws.
To circumvent that physical compliance trap, the industry relies on what Parikh calls digital twin compliance simulation. Before any copper is laid, engineers construct a perfect, highly granular 3D virtual simulation of the entire proposed data center.
A digital twin.
They simulate the exact thermal outputs, the electrical responses, and run physics engines to simulate the exact propagation patterns of the electromagnetic interference under maximum load. They prove compliance to regulators virtually before physical construction begins.
But the operational reality of a data center is highly dynamic. A massive AI training run might cause a cluster to suddenly draw double the power it was using an hour ago, instantly altering its thermal and electromagnetic profile.
Human operators cannot monitor and adjust power thresholds fast enough for those real-time fluctuations, which leads to the deployment of regulatory AI.
Autonomous compliance systems embedded directly into the silicon of the data center.
Exactly. These systems monitor hardware telemetry in real time. If a specific AI cluster is running an intense training load and sensors detect localized emissions spiking dangerously close to CCPA 32 limits.
Before a human engineer even sees it on a dashboard, the regulatory AI intervenes autonomously. It dynamically alters the processing clocks on the specific GPUs causing the spike, throttling their speed down for a fraction of a second.
Which drops the power draw, instantly reducing emissions back into legal compliance, all without interrupting the workload or needing human authorization.
The hardware actively governs its own legal compliance. We are looking at an ecosystem pushed to its absolute breaking point. The software models are legally trapped by the right to be forgotten, and the physical hardware generates so much heat and radiation it requires liquid immersion in AI watchdogs. The sheer volume of data being hoarded is overwhelming both physical and legal infrastructure.
Which is why the industry is slowly recognizing that the entire paradigm must shift. If physical data centers are overheating and software models can't forget anything, the only logical solution is to put less data into the system in the first place.
Which brings us to our final source material from VerifyWise, exploring the principle of data minimization. This is the direct antithesis of the hoarding mindset.
Data minimization is using only the specific data points strictly necessary for a defined task and discarding the rest. But the AI industry currently suffers from a massive hoarding problem.
The VerifyWise source cites that approximately 65% of the data in AI project datasets is either entirely redundant or non-essential to the model's function.
More than half of the data-consuming space in those liquid-cooled racks serves no operational purpose. It just increases energy costs, expands the attack surface for hackers, and escalates regulatory risk under the GDPR and the EU AI Act.
VerifyWise gives concrete examples of successfully transitioning to minimization. They detail a major ride-hailing company, like Uber or Lyft, developing an AI model to optimize dynamic pricing. Initially, they fed the model highly sensitive personal identifiers, exact age, specific gender, and precise real-time GPS location history mapped down to the meter.
But a minimization audit revealed the AI didn't need that granular intelligence to predict pricing surges. The model didn't need to know a user was exactly 34 years old or standing at a specific street address.
So they re-engineered it. They dropped exact age and full location trails, and instead fed the model aggregated travel zones and basic trip frequency metrics.
And the predictive accuracy remained completely stable while massively dropping their compliance risk profile.
They outline a parallel example in healthcare. A startup developed an AI triage diagnostic tool. Originally, it ingested patients' entire lifelong medical histories, every minor ailment over decades.
The audit showed diagnostic accuracy relied almost entirely on recent symptom clusters and immediate vital signs. By stopping the collection of full patient histories in favor of recent symptoms, the accuracy remained high, but their hypo-compliance burden practically vanished.
But doesn't AI need more data to be smart? The prevailing tech wisdom is that data is the new oil. If we force AI developers to strip out 65% of their data, are we just making the AI dumb?
It's a logical concern, but targeted high-quality data is often better. Removing statistical noise and redundant features can actually improve an AI's reasoning. The source material outlines 4 future-facing technical methods to balance AI performance and privacy without hoarding raw data.
Okay, let's break these down. How do we build smart AI without hoarding personal data?
The first is federated learning. Traditionally, training an AI requires centralizing raw data from millions of devices into a hyperscale data center. Federated learning inverts that.
Instead of moving the data to the model, you move the model to the data.
Exactly. Training happens locally on the user's device. Once the local training phase is complete, the device only transmits the newly calculated mathematical learnings, the updated statistical weights, back to the central server. The raw personal data never leaves the phone.
So a data breach at the central server yields nothing but abstract math. But the drawback is it requires immense local processing power and drains mobile batteries.
Right. The second technique, differential privacy, tackles the problem mathematically. It involves deliberately injecting mathematical random noise into a data set before the AI trains on it.
You're intentionally corrupting the data set, making it slightly incorrect on purpose.
Yes, to mathematically mask the identity of any single individual. Individual data can't be inferred, but the broad statistical trends across the population remain intact for the AI to learn from.
The unavoidable trade-off being a slight degradation in precision because of the injected noise.
Exactly. The third method addresses the right to be forgotten directly. Algorithmic destruction or machine unlearning.
The attempt to selectively remove data points without retraining the whole model, surgically extracting the single egg from the fully baked cake.
It's highly experimental. Engineers try to isolate and neutralize the specific statistical weights influenced by a targeted user's data. But mathematically guaranteeing every trace is neutralized in a trillion-parameter model borders on computationally impossible right now.
Which leads to the fourth solution, synthetic data. Abandoning actual human data in favor of artificially generated fake data.
Statistically authentic fake data. If you need 100,000 medical records to train a cardiac AI, you don't use real patient files and trigger APA. You use algorithms to study real data securely, then generate 100,000 entirely simulated records.
Simulated records that reflect exact statistical properties and clinical trends, but don't correspond to any actual human beings.
Right. You bypass the GDPR, CCPA, and Australian Privacy Act entirely because no actual privacy is breached.
It short-circuits the entire compliance trap. The journey through this material reveals staggering complexity. From the Australian compliance trap pulling businesses in 2 directions to the global standards of the CCPA and the 72-hour windows of the GDPR.
Down into the liquid-cooled racks of AI data centers and into the algorithmic brains of models like Operator that simply cannot forget.
So what does this all mean? If human laws demand that our personal history can be erased, but the fundamental architecture of artificial intelligence requires it to be permanently baked into a trillion-parameter mathematical web, are we approaching a future where personal data ceases to be something we own and simply becomes the permanent statistical fabric of the internet itself?
It's a structural shift in how information exists, and it's going to define the next decade of technology law.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We encourage you to actively audit what data you are leaving behind online, because the systems we are building are no longer simply storing our data, they are learning from it. And by design, they do not know how to forget.